Welcome to the John Monnet Center Montreal Winter 21 Speaker Series. Our speaker series, as I believe you all know, this term is on Europe in memory. So we're going to start with our presentation, which will be 40-ish minutes or so. Then we're going to have a discussant, David Talents, to kick things off, and we'll have open discussion until about 10:25. The talk itself will be recorded, but the Q&A will not. So please keep that in mind. And today I am so happy to welcome Dr. Nicole Iturriaga, who's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, although she's physically in California right now. This is our world today. And she's going to be starting a new position this summer at the University of California, Irvine, as an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Sociology. She's a political sociologist and a socio-legal scholar with expertise in state violence, forensics, social movements, human rights, and collective memory. And her talk today is based on her book manuscript, Exhuming Violent Histories, Forensics, Memory, and Rewriting Spain's Past, which is going to be published with Columbia University Press. So, Nicole, great to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. It's a little dark, it's because it's still nighttime here. So this is the title of my book. My research agenda, I broadly study how social actors use science, technology, and the law to voice their political grievances, their goals, and their challenges, and challenge the state, if you will. So Exhuming Violent Histories in general, the book argues that by grounding their claims in science, human rights workers can present themselves as impartial rather than partisan biased activists. So in other words, they're drawing from tropes of modernity, international protocols and science to present a depoliticized, and I use that sort of facetiously, a depoliticized account of state terror. So by depoliticized approach, I mean they can safely, meaningfully shape transitional justice efforts by challenging traditional beliefs about warranted state violence and terror, collective memories about that violence, through this deployment of these different tactics, and some of which I'll be talking about today. So today's talk, I'm going to be talking again about how activists with the Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory, which is the Spanish acronym here, and how they use a science-forward approach. So by doing that, they sidestep delegitimization efforts because they can say, we're not activists, we're just presenting the scientific facts of what we found. And I will go over a little bit who the association is. But this is also where they can introduce various claims. So this talk that I'm going to be doing is going to be focused on chapter 3 of the book. There's also a standalone article that came out of this, which really focuses on pedagogy and these classes that the association teaches at mass grave exhumations. And so while they're teaching what they call a class at the foot of the grave, they're giving crash courses through things, and they're also introducing depoliticized science framing, moral rights of the families, and sort of transitional justice arguments. So furthermore, I'm also showing that there are embodied objects that speak truth. And this is actual physical remains as well as objects found within the graves. And that these, using sort of ANT, so actor network theory and embodiment, I argue that those two things work together with these embodied agent objects to speak truths that emotionally connects the narrative that the association is giving to the people who are listening to the victims in the grave. So broadly, the research questions that I'm positing here are how human rights activists are using depoliticized forensic science to reframe histories of violence in post-conflict, post-authoritarian states, and how they are using various mechanisms such as scientific, historic pedagogy, embodiment of objects and remains to further their goal to restore identity, memory, and justice within a globalized context. But before we get into the specifics of the research, I just want to very generally put out what the theoretical frameworks that are guiding the larger project and this individual chapter, and then we'll get into the historical background, which is a little long, but we'll get through it quickly, I promise. So one of the main guiding frameworks I'm using here is necropower. So the idea that governments are using the threat of death to maintain control over their populations. And of course, that's coming from biopolitics, Foucault, and but this is sort of Membe is jumping off from that, suggesting that states are still using the threat of violent death to control their populations. So my research in itself sort of grounds itself in the literature and aims to illustrate how scientifically exhumed dead bodies from the Spanish Civil War and the Franco regime sort of become, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself, they become embodied, and that these versions, these narratives about these bodies is a form of negating state necro power. It's a way of being like, this is actually not the narrative that the state put forward. It's this other truth that's based in science. So just to go over that again, governments are using the threat of necro power. That also includes the narratives that explain the dead that they have killed. I'm arguing that activists are countering that with scientific exhumations of bodies. This gets into how do we understand the past, so collective memory, so commonly understood knowledge of past events. They don't have to be directly experienced. They're also dominant narratives of history that are often controlled by the state and political elites, but is not permanent, right? And so we also see with like in collective memory studies that there's an idea that you can counter, and that memories are constantly being countered by other actors. And so this is a long dance, and sort of memory should be thought of sort of sedimentary layers that have lots of different actors who are pushing and pulling these stories in different ways. So human rights actors are using a variety of tactics. And so one of those is framing. So I mentioned earlier this idea of depoliticized science is sort of like a frame. So is the rights of families, moral claims to justice. So a frame is a process of how we use interpretive schemas to negotiate, define, and understand experiences in the social environments that we find ourselves in. And so I'm arguing that these frames are sort of counter frames to the dominant narrative. And then in performativity and social movements, so since I'm arguing that these classes are a form of performativity, so the idea that social movements, by actualizing what they want, they're embodying and materializing the change in this, like that they're asking the world to do. So in this case, the association wants to find, identify, recover, and rebury the long missing dead from the Franco regime and the Spanish Civil War. Just by doing that, they're performing what they want and actualizing the change. So the other part of this paper, this chapter, is talking about actor network theory. So objects are not simply acted upon in this theory, but rather can influence action directly. It is more about networks between humans and non-human objects and these relationships where things can happen. So other researchers have talked about museum outlines or border policies as impacting human behavior through these networks. In my paper, I'm using A&T as a way to explain why certain objects have more agency and meaning and making their meaning-making abilities. So part of that is also embodiment. So embodiment of bodies, so human remains can become embodied with living memories of the dead. They can also be objects. So in Spain, most of the people who are directly related to the dead are also so the grandchildren are the ones who are around at this point. It's been quite a bit of time. Most of the people who would have known them in life are also very old or have passed. So there's a lot of connection to personal objects. This also just happens in general. Not everybody, when looking at a skeleton, can feel connected or can imagine a person or a life, but objects recall. It's so easy to imagine yourself using a common object or wearing a certain piece of jewelry. It makes it feel like it's real, like a real person, a real life, a real story. And so I'm suggesting that these two things work together to provide sort of an understanding of why this reframed version of the past violence is so powerful. It's because it's relying on the power, the agency, and voice of the remains and the objects. And it's intensifying for the people who are listening to these classes while looking at a mass grave with skeletons and remains and objects. So it's very intense, and that I think that's why these classes in part are so intense. It's not just listening to a historical retelling of past violence or about what they've found scientifically in a grave. It's also looking at these agent-embodied objects that are also telling a very powerful story. So very quickly, the data and methods for this. So I did 15 months of participant observations I conducted with the Spanish Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory across 2 different waves from 2015 to 2017. I used the multi-sided approach so I could follow their work across their different places where they were working, either in the south of Spain, the north of Spain, in the laboratory, their public memory events. I also did 200 informal interviews with people who are visiting technical sites or their actions. I also interviewed 15 activists and 15 non-activists. I also did a discourse analysis of visitor guest books, of media of a local homage and burial event. The discourse analysis also included the visitor guest books, so people can sign and write little notations at mass grave exhumations when they come to visit. There's a little guest book, so I also analyzed that. And just I'd like to call your attention to the map. The map itself is of all of the known mass graves in Spain from the Spanish Civil War and the Franco regime. And I think the association has only recovered about 9,000 of them. But yeah, so this is a sort of a visualization of, if you've ever been to Spain, you've probably walked on a mass grave. So very quickly, we're gonna go over the Spanish Civil War in about 5 seconds. So I can't do any justice to how complex the Civil War was. If you're interested, I can absolutely give you citations on where you can look to read more on this. But basically, July 17th, 1936 began a military coup against the Second Republic, which was a democratic government at the time. Eventually, it was led by Francisco Franco, and it was supported by these efforts of what they call themselves the nationalists. I call them rebels because that's technically what they were given an upper hand militarily because both Hitler and Mussolini gave military support to Franco. The nationalists, the rebels, when they came into different places, they were extremely brutal on purpose. They met, even when they didn't meet any resistance, they would massacre most anybody who they didn't like. And these massacres started often with some sort of version of a political ideology, but would usually turn into, I don't like that guy, so you should kill him. So by the end of the war, about 500,000 Spaniards had lost their lives. This doesn't include an estimated 100 or 150,000 civilians who died in extrajudicial killings as well. Democracy had fallen, and Francisco Franco was in power. And he would be there a long time. So he ruled from 1939 to 1975. His regime penetrated all aspects of life, everything. So this was to ensure that his opposition, like there wouldn't be no opposition. There just would not be room for opposition. So this repression went way beyond mass killings. It included economic, psychological, cultural, and physical punishments, including systematic use of rape, death marches, torture, looting, and ethnocide, and the total obliteration of collective memory. Somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people were also executed in the immediate post-war. Right, like 1939, and this did not include people who died of maltreatment. So for example, in Cordoba in 1941, close to over 500 people died because they just didn't give them water. There's also another 90,000 people who were forced into labor internment. So a lot of like land and dams and stuff were worked on by slaves. A lot of people died in that too. And literally the crime of getting that kind of long-term punishment could have just been being a member of a union. So in terms of death, the Republicans, so the people on the losing side were banned from mourning, finding, burying, even mentioning that they had a loved one. I heard a lot of stories of people under the cover of darkness throwing flowers over walls to where they thought the graves were. Another really sad story was this woman who kept trying to make some sort of memorial to her husband who had been killed by the rebel forces. And eventually she sort of gave up, but she sprinkled all these seeds, lily seeds, the flowers. So every spring they still bloom. And in theory, that is where the grave is. But that was literally the amount of mourning you could do in a very deeply Catholic country. That was extremely painful. The Republicans were also always blamed for any kind of problem. And also the idea that the violence could come back at any time was Franco's like main narrative. Like, you're lucky I'm here. I protected you against communism. But if you ever try to rebel, people are going to die again. That was bad. And definitely the Republicans were Marxists who were deserving of death, continued to stay, pretty much lasted through the entire regime. So Franco dies in 1975. So the person who had been set to replace him, some of you might know this, was Blanco, and he was assassinated by the Basque separatist group in 1973 with a giant car bomb that sent his car over a wall. So there really was no choice. They had to transition to democracy, and that lasted from 1975 to 1978. So during the transition, political elites decided that it would be better if they did what's called the Pact of Silence, Pact of Forgetting. And this also included the amnesty law. So the idea of the Pact of Silence or Forgetting is that we leave the past in the past. We can't bring it forward. It's just going to open old wounds and bring the violence back. So we're going to leave everything behind. We're going to pass this amnesty law. And so the amnesty law not only covered all of the people who participated in the Franco regime, all of the violence, but also let go some of the people who were still languishing in prisons from those very long internments. So this was, in theory, to help both sides. It's also the time where they maintained all the institutions of the regime. So all of judges, main ministers of the government, they stayed in power. So unlike sort of de-Ba'athification, if you will, in Iraq, we see just the maintenance of all of the institutions, all of the main power elite stay the same. What transfers is now we're calling it a democracy. It's no longer Franco, but mostly all of the same people are still in power. This is also around the time that they're doing the first round of exhumations, which were not scientific. Some families just wanted their loved ones back, knew they were in a ditch, went and got them, commingled the remains, and reburied them. This kept going until 1981, when there was a coup attempt that was put down, but basically just reinforced that it was not safe to participate in these sort of actions, and it was better to just keep your head down. So I'm going to jump in time to Argentina. So in the 1980s, 1976 and 1983, there was a military junta in Argentina. They killed a lot of people, and they also disappeared living children who they were illegally adopted out. During the transition, I'm like speeding through here. Again, if you have any questions on this particular time period, I'm happy to go over that later. But during the transition, after the military regime resigned in 1983, after the disaster in the Falkland Islands, they had a transition. The democratic transition government wanted to bring in scientific experts to help understand what happened. They brought in a man named Dr. Clyde Snow. Dr. Snow was a forensic anthropologist who was extremely famous for, he was pretty famous for having identified Mengele's body in Brazil. He came and he did a conference sort of in front of people, and a family member came up to him and said, "Is it possible for an infant to dissolve?" And he said, "I don't know what you mean." And he said, "Well, my daughter and her family were killed in a shootout. We went to bury them. The coroner told us that the baby's bones were so delicate that they dissolved like water." Dr. Snow was intrigued by this. He then got a sort of ragtag team of students from the local university to participate in exhumations. He exhumed the family. And what he found was they had not been shot out in like a shootout, but had actually been summarily executed within, I think, about 20, 30 centimeters. And that in the infant's grave, what had been there was remains of a human foot, a dog, and pieces of clothing, but nothing had ever decomposed there. So the suggestion was there never was a baby in that casket. And that led to the larger question of, well, where's the baby? It also led to the birth of the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, the EEAF, and they spread this idea. They created this team, and they went around the world basically and spread forensic human rights practices. And they set up labs in Guatemala, in Chile, in Peru, most of the Southern Cone. They were also helped big part of the team in Bosnia. They set up the lab in Cyprus. They also pay for the Association of Recovery for Historical Memories DNA testing. And basically, his major quote that people say a lot is that bones speak softly, but they never lie. And so these pictures on the side, that's Dr. Snow in the top right corner. The middle one is the EEAF doing a mass grave exhumation in Argentina. And then the bottom are the grandmothers who part of this story with the little baby is that this then also helps the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo start looking for missing children. And what they're looking at is the very, very, very beginnings of DNA testing, because DNA testing did not exist until 1989, but they did have sort of blood testing before that, where they were able to concretely prove that children had been stolen and illegally adopted out to people sympathetic or in the regime. And they're still searching for the 500 missing grandchildren. I believe they're close to 140 at this point. I also did some work with them for the larger book project. So back to Spain. Here we are in 1998. I don't know how many of you remember this, but in 1998, Judge Baltasar Garzón put out an arrest warrant for Augusto Pinochet, the former dictator of Chile, when he was vacationing in the UK. This set up a huge diplomatic nightmare for the British, which ultimately culminated in Pinochet pretending to have Alzheimer's or dementia so he could go home. But this also led to what some scholars call an eruption of memory in Spain, where people went, wait a minute, why are we looking at this guy when we have a country full of human rights abusers ourselves? This led to the first scientific exhumation in Spain after Emilio Silva wrote an article saying my grandfather too was a desaparecido, which is a disappeared person, using sort of connecting the Spanish case to the Latin American context. This led to someone calling him and saying, let's go find your grandfather. They did the first exhumation, scientific exhumation in Spain in 2000, where they exhumed 13 people and identified and recovered Emilio's grandfather. This led to a massive memory movement, with the Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory becoming the first major organization, and then a whole bunch came up after that. This led to the Law of Historical Memory in 2007, which gave some money to associations to do exhumations that sort of privatized that, but it also made big monuments and fascist plaques. So Franco really loved putting his name on everything. So there's a lot of street signs, statues, things like that. This law made all of that illegal. And that ended more or less in 2011 when a right-wing government came in and did all financial support to these organizations. They've been very, very obstinate to any sort of memory work. And that sort of ended in 2018 when the Socialist Party came into control. For those of you who are watching Spanish politics, talk a little bit at the end about what that looks like now. But just for these pictures, the bottom left is a Franco statue that's being removed. Actually, the very, very last statue to Franco was just removed about 2 weeks ago. So if that gives you any sense of how long some of these have lasted. The middle one is one of the first major mass graves that were exhumed scientifically in Spain. And then the last one, of course, is the massive Valley of the Fallen, El Valle de los Caídos, which is right outside of Madrid, which is where Franco was buried for a very long time. And it's a giant mass grave / monument to fascism. It's quite scary if you go there. It's very intense. So let's just pop into it. So what you're looking at are pictures of people who come from the local towns and villages to see these exhumations. So a lot of these exhumations really are happening in rural parts of Spain. So people come because they've heard about it through word of mouth, or they've read about it in the newspaper. They also post their work on Facebook and social media. So people in the area know that these things are happening, or they're just walking to the market and stumble upon a bunch of people digging a hole in an area that's known to have a mass grave. And so they've come, and then once there's like a good amount of people, the lead forensic archaeologist will start what they call is like the class at the foot of the grave. And basically, it starts off by explaining exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it in that particular order. So there's a lot of focus on using UN protocols for mass graves, so that's sort of grounding their work already as being internationally recognized. And then it turns into a crash course into forensic anthropology, like how can you tell the biological sex? It's usually like if they have bodies that are different sex, will be like the female body here has a pelvis that's spread open, and such forth. So they'll point it out. They'll also point out how they can tell age, if there's any perimortem, so like pre-death injuries that happen near or around the time of death. And they use, of course, the bodies that are available to them And they also then weave in the historical work. So they also have a historian on staff who, so to even get to this point, to have an exhumation, you have to do a tremendous amount of historical work. Also go out and look multiple times, because a lot of these topographies have changed since 1939. So there's a lot of comparing of old maps to what it is now, on praying that a freeway hasn't been built over it, which has happened a few times. But so they're telling the story that they have learned from the families, from what they've learned from the historical research. And often visitors already know these stories. So they'll pop in new details if they happen to know them. But so the archaeologists will then be pointing out exactly what people are doing, where they are in the process, the tools, the importance, the painstaking nature of the work, and then how that later the bones will then go through an anthropological analysis, usually by a visiting forensic anthropologist, who will then fully give a report later to the family. And then they start explaining some of the challenges that they're facing. So the lack of national support, the fact that there's no DNA database that's national, and that there's no Spanish lab that was willing to help them with their DNA work, which is why they were forced, if you will, to go to Argentina to ask the LAF to help them. And they ground this as being one of the most important influential laboratories in the entire world, believes in the work of the association. And because of that, they have the capacity to test DNA against the bodies, and that without the support of the most tremendous, important team, they would not be able to do this, because not a single Spanish laboratory was willing to help them. So yeah, that's how these start. And so once these, they're really, so my point here is that they're really grounding themselves in their credibility in scientific aficionados. They have their protocols, the process, as well as the backing of one of the most important forensic teams in the world. And this also allows them to claim the legitimacy of being the speakers of Spain's true history. And that once that this is grounded, they can then sort of push more, a little more of a critique can be introduced. So just a quick little background on how families are able to gain access to the association. So they have to ask, they have to fill out a report. Again, this is all within the Minnesota protocols of, from the United Nations. And again, it's easier if it happened after the war ended, because the government, the Franco regime, documented everything. So if it happened to be after 1939, it tends to be easier to find them. So this picture in the left-hand corner is them looking at one of these old maps that were actually taken by American, it was like Army, or maybe it was Air Force. They took all these pictures of these maps because the US government, due to Cold War politics, ignored Franco's relationship to Hitler and Mussolini in favor of they were anti-communist. So that map that he's looking at is actually from a US plane. So the point here is that when they're telling the story of how they do this work to the people who are visiting, they point out that the most important part is to find these people and let the families decide how they're going to be buried instead of the people who killed them. So they're really grounding their entire work as being for the rights of families to recover their loved ones, so that they can know what happened to them officially and bury them according to their own wishes, instead of how the murderers decided they should bury them. They point out that families do not pay because they believe that the state, as the lead archaeologist would say, the state has a responsibility to pay for this, but since they are not doing it, we will do it. And again, that's sort of like a very slight critique of the state, not a full-blown political argument. So the rights of the families has long been a stance of the association, and it's something they have received some criticism for. Other teams have been much more politically involved. There was Forum for Memory, and they were deeply connected to the Communist Party. So when they would do exhumations, there would be flags and songs and lots of political statements. They have not fared as well. They no longer do exhumations. They are basically an online advocacy group. But when talking to the association leadership, some of them said, you know, everyone who comes here knows that this is about red politics. Like, why is it necessary to bring that up and like potentially scare off anybody who's interested in what's going on? And so they're aware that this is already associated with sort of liberal politics, and that they are intentionally trying to sort of mitigate that, to be able to maybe reach a different person who would otherwise never even approach if there were flags or SARS happening. And so here we have sort of the framing of the association that they are the will and agency of victims' families, and they're not a political organization with political goals. So they're already sidestepping the politics while sort of gently walking around them. And they're also placing the emphasis on science. These are scientific exhumations, and it's the medium for how families and communities can gain closure for wounds that never actually healed. Is also connecting their work to the narrative that families, and this is a sort of a global forensics-based human rights framing, everybody has the right to recover their loved ones. I realize I am running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So getting into embodiment and A&T, so like after they talk about all the technical stuff, they usually point out if they found objects such as bullets, buttons, things don't really last 80 years well in the ground, but what do last are wedding rings, earrings, buttons, belts, things like that. So they point out objects of violence also. So again, these were victims of violent death, so there often are pretty easily seen bullet holes, and most people are very attracted to this. People tend to lean in and go, oh, wow. Like, wow, that's a really intense bullet hole. And it's also, I don't know, assuming no one here has seen a mass grave, but if you can go with me here, when you're looking at it, it's like time has stopped. You can totally easily imagine this is how someone threw a body in, this is how they're laying. So you have a story in your mind, like this one in the right-hand corner, he's sort of lying like this. He was clearly just sort of like thrown in, landed there, stayed there. So visitors already have this very visceral sense of what's going on. Signs of violence were also in the interviews brought up a lot as being the clearest truth of Spanish history, that you can't manipulate this with politics. There's a bullet hole, that person dies that way, and that's it. One of the women I was talking to said she came because she saw it in the newspaper and that she had to know what happened to these boys because she'd heard about it. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. And again, that bones speak more honestly than any politician. So here is some examples of, I'm just going to blow through this, but it's from the little visitor guest books. And basically it was like, one of them was saying, seeing that little hole in the cranium, it was just incredible. And it's, you're shining light onto darkness that bullets bring. So the signs of violence were incredibly powerful. They were very resonant. They are very clear truths. It's hard to deny that that's what's going on. In terms of objects, so objects tend to be a little different, and not everybody feels connected to remains, even with signs of violence. Sometimes it's something like a red earring, which I'll call your attention to at the bottom left, was a woman who was about 24. She died with her family. She has, if you can notice really close on the corner, there is a comb that would have been in her hair, and she has one red earring on her cranium. The other one was missing. This was one of the most intense exhumations. People were very drawn to this woman with the one earring and the hair comb. There was also stories that she had been pregnant at the time of death. And the association leadership who were doing the classes at the time asked the group, what was the kind of threat that this woman could have been to the state to justify her execution? How can the government say that this story of this woman should not be told, or that she should have no justice, and that we should never talk about this? And that's a very powerful argument when you're also looking at her body, and you can maybe imagine you like earrings and wear earrings. On the other side, we have a shoe that was of a 15 to 17-year-old boy who died alongside his father. The shoe was displayed during the exhumation class, the class during the grave. And the shoe was really, very, very powerful. And he asked the class, how can this violence, the silence and continued impunity be justified? We're looking at the remains of a child who was clearly out with his dad tending the farm. They had a little bag for cow, little agricultural stuff. And the point here is that objects speak. They tell a story about someone's life, what they were doing. an association activist, said she didn't have any problems when she was doing a major exhumation of about 24 people, and she didn't feel anything until she saw shoes that had been worn down in the same exact way that her shoe had been worn down. And then she realized, like, this person walked the same way that I walk. They were having a life, and then it was over, and it was just taken from them. So the point here, I'm run out of time, is that like objects really tell a story. They're embodied with the lives of the dead. They humanize vacant skeletons, and the images you're seeing here are they are of Art Deco. I'm thinking of the Spanish word, it's gemelos, cufflinks. So these cufflinks were found. This man was a tailor. His grandchildren didn't even know he existed because the family was so afraid. They just buried the story, and they were surprised when the association contacted them to say, hey, we found your grandfather. And the grandson said, what a beautiful remembrance. We can't wait to take him home with us. And so for him, the cufflinks were the most real part of his grandfather. Again, so objects, they sketch out a basic outline of a life. They intensify the contextualization of the story that's being told to them by the association. And they really, truly embody what's lost. You can imagine if a skeleton is wearing shoes made out of tires, you can imagine someone who was very clever making shoes that would work. A wedding ring speaks to the existence of a family life, maybe a child that was left behind. A hair comb, earrings speak to a fashion of a woman. These objects really tell stories, and it tells the story of the cruelty of state terror as well. Last but not least, they often have Q&A, so question and answers at the end, and this can go in many different directions, and I'm just, for time's sake, going to jump into this one. I was at one class where the village elders took the Q&A to apologize to the families that were there, the victims' families, and said to them, I want to thank the team for their tremendous work. I want to thank them for allowing us to close this painful chapter in our town. It's very emotional to see this. And I want to say, I'm sorry for what was done to your family. They were not bad, like they said, and neither are we. And we're so sorry that this happened. And we hope that you have peace. And while this is not what happens at every single one of these, it was a very powerful moment because it allowed the facilitation of these different people to talk to each other outside of sort of the historical narrative of these people were bad and we were good. It allowed for atonement. It allowed for the opportunity for both sides to express their sadness and their guilt over the past, and that sort of this relief that this chapter was over. And not, again, this doesn't always happen, but the fact that this could happen at all is very important in terms of, I don't really believe in closure, but in terms of these things, but something akin to that is possible when you allow these sort of moments to open what's happened to public conversation. So in conclusion, the association is using sort of pedagogical performative interventions that produces sort of a depoliticized scientific narrative that also introduces moral and judicial claims. So it sidesteps any sort of delegitimization. They're not political actors. They're just technicians who are showing you what they found in their work. They're also positioning themselves as the translators of the real history of Spain. There's the translators of these objects as well. And that the agency and embodiment of remains and objects reclaim the dead as fellow citizens. These are no longer just evil Marxists who were bent on destroying Spain. They were citizens of the same country, of the same culture, who need to come back, be reincorporated. And it also is sort of democratizing the ownership of historical narrative. And I'm going to blow through that so that I can get to this. So just for fun, Franco was exhumed from the Valle de los Caídos in October of 2019. He was reburied in a private cemetery, which is a very strange cemetery. There's lots of dead fascists there, including the ex-dictator of the Dominican Republic, Trujillo, is also here. And what happened? Nothing. People partied in Puerto del Sol. There was no major violence, and that's that. So, sorry for going a little over.
No, that's all right. That's all right. For the 40-ish minutes is a suggestion rather than a command. Thanks so much for that fascinating talk.